The solicitor's voice droned on through the musty drawing room of Westbrook Manor, but Miss Arabella Sinclair heard nothing beyond the thundering of her own heart. She sat rigid in the horsehair chair her grandmother had once favoured, her gloved hands folded in her lap, with the precision of someone accustomed to making herself small and unobtrusive. At 26, Arabella had long since accepted her position in life as a poor relation, tolerated but never truly welcomed, existing on the fringes of a world that had little use for women without fortune or exceptional beauty. Yet, here she sat, in the grandest room of an estate she had visited only twice before, listening to words that seemed plucked from some fantastical novel rather than the dry proceedings of a legal reading. The late Duke of Ravenscroft, a distant cousin she had met precisely once at a funeral when she was 12 years old, had named her as his sole heir. It was by any measure impossible. Arabella possessed nothing of value save her mother's cameo brooch and a stubborn pride that refused to bend despite years of genteel poverty. She had spent her adult life as a companion to elderly widows, enduring their complaints and demands with patient grace while dreaming of a cottage somewhere quiet where she might grow roses and read books without interruption. She had never dreamed of this. A duchy, an estate of some 40,000 acres, a fortune that the solicitor was even now describing in terms that made her head spin. Miss Sinclair, the solicitor repeated, peering at her over his spectacles with evident concern. Do you understand what I have explained? Arabella moistened her lips, aware that every eye in the room was fixed upon her with varying degrees of shock, resentment, or calculation. I confess, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, that I am struggling to comprehend. The Duke and I shared only the most distant connection. We met once years ago. I cannot fathom why he would choose me as his heir. The solicitor, a thin, precise man named Mr. Pembroke, shuffled his papers with an air of practised neutrality. His Grace was most specific in his wishes. He believed you to be possessed of qualities he valued: integrity, resilience, and a character uncorrupted by the excesses of society. He watched your progress through life with interest, Miss Sinclair, though you were unaware of his attention. From across the room came a sound of poorly suppressed outrage. Lady Millicent Harcourt, the Duke's sister-in-law, rose from her chair with the rigid bearing of a woman gravely offended. "This is preposterous," she declared, her voice sharp as cut glass. "My husband was the Duke's own brother. My son is of his direct bloodline. And you expect us to believe that the entire Ravenscroft fortune passes to some obscure relation none of us have ever heard of?" The tension in the room crackled like lightning before a storm. Arabella felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, acutely, aware of her modest grey dress, her serviceable boots, the careful mending at her cuffs that marked her as a woman of reduced circumstances. She did not belong here, in this room of gilded mirrors and ancestral portraits. She was an interloper, an accident of fate that had disrupted the natural order of things. Mr. Pembroke remained unruffled by Lady Millicent's outburst. The Duke's wishes were clear and legally binding, madam. He was of sound mind when he drafted this will, and he employed considerable effort to ensure it would withstand any challenge. Before Lady Millicent could respond, the drawing-room doors burst open with enough force to send them crashing against the walls. The servant who had been standing guard stumbled backward as a figure strode into the room, bringing with him the cold bite of autumn wind and an aura of barely contained fury. Arabella's breath caught in her throat. The man who stood framed in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the manor's ancient foundations. Dark hair, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, swept back from features that combined aristocratic refinement with an almost savage intensity. His grey eyes, the colour of storm clouds gathering over the moors, swept the room with an expression of cold assessment before landing upon Arabella with the force of a physical blow. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "This is the woman who has stolen my inheritance." The room erupted into chaos. Lady Millicent rushed forward with exclamations of relief and triumph. Mr. Pembroke clutched his papers protectively to his chest. The servants who had been hovering at the edges of the room pressed themselves against the walls as though hoping to disappear into the woodwork. And Arabella simply sat, frozen in her grandmother's chair, staring at the man whose very existence had just complicated her already impossible situation beyond all measure. For this was Lord Marcus Ravenscroft, the Duke's only son, a man who had been presumed dead for 7 years following his disappearance during a disastrous expedition to the wilds of the East. He had returned from the grave, it seemed, just in time to contest a will that had named a stranger as heir to everything that should rightfully have been his. The fire in the grate crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney while the autumn wind rattled the windows of the study where Arabella now found herself facing Lord Marcus across a vast mahogany desk. Mr. Pembroke had retreated to fetch additional documents, leaving them alone in a silence that pressed against her ears with almost physical weight. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, and her gaze fixed on a point just past Lord Marcus's left shoulder, unwilling to meet those piercing grey eyes that seemed capable of seeing straight through to her very soul. "You are remarkably composed," he observed, his voice carrying that same dangerous edge she had noted in the drawing room. Most women would be in tears by now, faced with such a situation. Arabella allowed herself a small, humourless smile. "I have learned, my lord, that tears accomplish very little. They certainly do not pay rent or purchase bread. I was not raised with the luxury of excessive emotion." Something flickered in his expression, too quickly for her to identify. His fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the desk's polished surface, drawing her attention to hands that bore the calluses and scars of hard labour rather than the smooth manicured digits of a gentleman. Where had he been these 7 years? What had he endured that had left such visible marks upon him? She found herself curious despite her better judgment, drawn to the mystery of this man who had returned from supposed death to complicate everything she had never dared to dream of having. "My father," Lord Marcus said finally, "believed me dead." His voice had lost some of its sharp edge, replaced by something that might have been grief carefully contained. He believed it because that is what the authorities told him, what the survivors of the expedition reported. "He mourned me, Miss Sinclair. He wore black for 2 years and never truly recovered from the loss." Arabella's throat tightened with unexpected sympathy. She had known loss herself, had watched her mother fade away over the course of a single bitter winter, had buried her father when she was barely more than a child. Whatever her current circumstances, whatever threat this man posed to her newly acquired fortune, she could not remain unmoved by the raw pain that lurked beneath his controlled exterior. "I am sorry," she said quietly, and meant it with every fibre of her being. "Truly sorry, my lord. No parent should have to endure such anguish." His jaw tightened. "Yet you sit in his house, prepared to claim his fortune, everything that should have been mine by right of blood and birth. Your sympathy rings hollow, Miss Sinclair." The accusation stung, but Arabella refused to flinch. She met his gaze directly now, her chin lifting with the stubborn pride that had sustained her through years of genteel poverty. "I did not ask for this inheritance, my lord. I did not scheme for it, did not even know of my connection to the Duke until his solicitor appeared at my employer's door with news that seemed too fantastical to credit. I am as bewildered by this turn of events as anyone. Yet you accepted," he pressed. "You did not refuse the fortune, did not insist it be given to its rightful heir." "The rightful heir," Arabella replied with careful precision, "was believed to be dead. The Duke chose to leave his estate to me rather than to Lady Millicent's son. That was his decision, my lord, not mine. If you wish to contest it, that is your right. But I will not be painted as a villain for circumstances entirely beyond my control. For a moment, Lord Marcus simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth curved upward in what might have been the ghost of a smile. You have spirit, Miss Sinclair. I had expected a timid creature, easily intimidated into surrendering what my father foolishly bequeathed to her. Instead, I find a woman who meets my accusations with logic and dignity. My father, it seems, chose better than I credited him. Before Arabella could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, Mr. Pembroke returned, his arms laden with documents, and his face creased with the particular anxiety of a man caught between immovable forces. My lord, Miss Sinclair, I believe I have found the relevant precedents. This situation, as you might imagine, is most irregular. The hours that followed were a blur of legal terminology and ancient statutes, of arguments and counter-arguments that made Arabella's head pound with their complexity. The essential facts, however, became increasingly clear. The Duke's will was ironclad, but Lord Marcus's return from the dead created complications that would take months, perhaps years, to fully resolve in the courts. In the meantime, neither party could claim sole ownership of the estate, forcing them into an awkward arrangement that pleased no one. You expect me to share my home with a stranger? Lord Marcus demanded, his composure finally cracking under the weight of Mr. Pembroke's pronouncements. Westbrook Manor, the solicitor corrected gently, belonged to your father, my lord, and he left it to Miss Sinclair. It is, if we are being precise, her home, which she is graciously allowing you to share. The look Lord Marcus directed at Arabella contained enough heat to ignite the documents on the desk between them. She held his gaze without wavering, though her heart hammered against her ribs with sufficient force that she feared he might hear it. It seems, she said with a calm she did not feel, that fate has bound us together, my lord, at least until the courts decide otherwise. I suggest we make the best of an uncomfortable situation. His laugh was short and bitter. Make the best of it? You speak as though we are to be neighbours sharing a garden fence, not adversaries fighting for control of a duchy. We are whatever we choose to be, Arabella replied quietly. I have no wish to be your enemy, Lord Marcus. I never sought this inheritance, never dreamed of living in such grandeur. If the courts ultimately decide in your favour, I will accept their judgment and return to my former life without complaint. But until that day comes, I refuse to spend my days at war with a man whose only crime was surviving against all odds. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening around the eyes that transformed his harsh features into something approaching handsomeness. For a moment, Arabella glimpsed the man he might have been before tragedy and hardship had carved those lines around his mouth. Before 7 years of God knew what suffering had turned him into this guarded, suspicious creature. You speak of acceptance so easily, he said, his voice losing some of its edge. Have you never wanted anything badly enough to fight for it? The question caught her off guard, striking closer to truths she preferred to keep buried. She thought of the dreams she had abandoned, the hopes she had carefully folded away like summer dresses packed for a winter that might never end. She thought of the girl she had been, full of romantic notions and impossible yearnings, before reality had taught her the bitter lessons of her station. I have wanted many things, my lord, she admitted softly. But I learned long ago that wanting and having are very different matters. I learned to be content with what I had, to find joy in small mercies rather than pine for grand impossibilities. Perhaps that makes me weak in your eyes. I prefer to think of it as wisdom. Lord Marcus studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she had not experienced in years. Then he rose from his chair, his tall frame seeming to fill the study with his presence. "We shall see, Miss Sinclair," he said, moving toward the door. "We shall see what you are truly made of." The first weeks of their enforced cohabitation passed in a state of armed truce. Lord Marcus retreated to the east wing of the manor, surrounding himself with the journals and maps from his expedition, emerging only for meals that he took in pointed silence. Arabella established herself in the more modest rooms of the West Wing, slowly learning the rhythms of her new household and winning over the suspicious servants with quiet competence and genuine kindness. Mrs. Garrett, the housekeeper, proved an invaluable ally, warming to Arabella's practical approach and her refusal to put on airs despite her elevated circumstances. "She is not what I expected," Arabella overheard Mrs. Garrett tell the cook one morning, passing by the kitchen door on her way to the library. "Not high and mighty like Lady Millicent predicted. Works alongside us when there is need, knows how to stretch a penny, speaks to everyone like they matter." If you ask me, the old Duke knew what he was about. The words warmed Arabella more than she cared to admit. She had spent so many years being overlooked, tolerated, dismissed as inconsequential, that simple acceptance felt like an extraordinary gift. Yet even as she began to find her footing in this strange new world, she remained acutely aware of Lord Marcus's brooding presence in the East Wing, a storm cloud perpetually threatening to break. Their paths crossed rarely at first, limited to stiff nods in corridors and terse exchanges at the dinner table. But as autumn deepened into the chill of early winter, circumstances began to force them into closer contact. The estate required decisions that neither could make alone. Tenants needed meeting. Accounts required examination. Arabella discovered that Lord Marcus, for all his hostility toward her, possessed a genuine knowledge of and affection for the land he had grown up on. He knew every farmer by name, every boundary stone by heart, every challenge that the harsh northern climate presented to those who worked the soil. "You love this place," she observed one afternoon, as they rode together across the frost-bitten fields to inspect a disputed fence line. "Despite everything, despite being away for so long, your heart never truly left Ravenscroft." Lord Marcus's hands tightened on his reins, his jaw working as though he struggled against words that wished to escape. "This land is in my blood, Miss Sinclair. My ancestors built this estate from nothing. They fought for it, died for it, poured their lives into every field and forest. When I was lost in those God-forsaken jungles, not knowing if I would live to see another dawn, it was thoughts of Ravenscroft that kept me sane. The memory of these hills, these skies, this cold northern wind that cut straight to the bone, I survived because I could not bear to leave it behind forever." The raw honesty of his confession stole her breath. Here, finally, was a glimpse beneath the armour he wore so constantly, a window into the wounded soul behind the hostile facade. Arabella understood with sudden clarity why he resented her so deeply. It was not merely about money or legal rights. She represented the ultimate betrayal. A stranger claiming the birthright he had suffered 7 years of hell to reclaim. "I cannot give you back those 7 years," she said quietly, her words forming clouds of vapour in the frigid air. "I cannot undo whatever horrors you endured or heal the wounds that time inflicted upon you. But I want you to know, my lord, that I understand now why you despise me. I am living the life you should have had, walking halls that echo with your ancestors' footsteps, making decisions about land your family has held for generations. It must be unbearable." Lord Marcus brought his horse to a halt, turning to face her with an expression she could not quite read. The winter light caught the planes of his face, highlighting the silver that threaded through his dark hair at the temples, the fine lines that radiated from the corners of his eyes. He looked older than his years, this man who had come back from the dead, aged by experiences she could only imagine. "Do you know what is truly unbearable, Miss Sinclair?" His voice was rough, stripped of its usual coldness. The fact that I cannot hate you. God knows I have tried. I have lain awake at night cataloguing every reason I should despise you, every argument for why you are nothing but a fortune hunter who has stolen what should be mine. But then I watch you with the tenants, see how you treat the servants, observe the way you study the account books with genuine concern for the welfare of those who depend on this estate. I find myself unable to sustain the hatred that would make this situation so much simpler. Arabella's heart stuttered in her chest. She had grown accustomed to his hostility, had armoured herself against his cutting remarks and cold dismissals. This sudden vulnerability left her defenceless, uncertain how to respond. Perhaps, she ventured carefully, we might try for something other than hatred. A truce at the very least. An alliance if we are capable of it. Whatever the courts eventually decide, we both want what is best for Ravenscroft. Surely that common ground is enough to build upon. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Then slowly, he extended his gloved hand. A truce then, Miss Sinclair, until fate determines which of us shall triumph. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his grip, even through the leather of their gloves. Something passed between them in that moment, something Arabella could not name but felt with every fibre of her being. It was as though the universe had shifted slightly on its axis, rearranging possibilities she had never dared to consider. Arabella, she heard herself say, if we are to be allies, you should call me by my given name. His lips curved in what might have been the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Arabella, then. And I am Marcus, though I confess the formality of my title has become a comfortable armour over the years. Then we shall have to work on dismantling it. Marcus, she replied, surprised by her own boldness. His laugh, unexpected and genuine, rang across the frozen fields like a bell announcing some momentous change. As they turned their horses back toward the manor, Arabella realised with a start that the knot of anxiety she had carried in her chest since arriving at Ravenscroft had loosened for the first time. Something was shifting between them, something that promised to be either wonderful or terrible, and she found herself unable to predict which. Winter settled over Ravenscroft like a heavy blanket, muffling the world in white silence. The great house, which had seemed so cold and unwelcoming when Arabella first arrived, gradually transformed into something approaching a home. She found herself learning its secrets, discovering the way morning light poured through the library windows at precisely 10:30, the hidden passage between the drawing room and the study that had once allowed servants to move unseen, the ancient oak in the garden that Mrs. Garrett claimed had been planted by the first Duke of Ravenscroft himself. And always, threading through these discoveries like a golden thread through plain cloth, was Marcus. Their truce had evolved into something warmer, their shared dinners becoming occasions for genuine conversation rather than tense silence. He told her of his travels, of the wonders and horrors he had witnessed in distant lands, of the friends he had lost and the enemies he had survived. She shared her own stories in return, smaller tales of a quieter life, of the books she had loved and the dreams she had harboured, and the small kindnesses that had sustained her through years of genteel poverty. "You are remarkable, you know," Marcus said one evening, as they sat together in the library while snow fell silently past the windows. "Most women of gentle birth, faced with the circumstances you have endured, would have become bitter or broken. Yet here you are, facing down a hostile stranger with nothing but your wit and your dignity. How did you learn such resilience?" Arabella considered the question, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "I suppose I had no choice. When my father died, my mother and I were left with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. We moved from relative to relative, dependent on charity that was often grudgingly given. Mother worked herself to exhaustion trying to maintain appearances, to preserve my prospects for a good marriage, though we both knew such hopes were futile. She died when I was 19, worn thin by years of struggle. After that, it was survive or surrender, and surrender was never in my nature. Marcus leaned forward, his grey eyes intent upon her face. And what of marriage? Surely there were offers, opportunities to escape your circumstances through more conventional means. A rueful smile touched her lips. There were offers of a sort, none that a woman with any self-respect could accept. I learned early that my lack of fortune made me prey rather than prize in the eyes of certain men. I preferred honest work to a degrading alliance. The anger that flashed across his features surprised her with its intensity. They should be horsewhipped, he said darkly. Any man who would prey upon a woman in vulnerable circumstances deserves far worse. Perhaps, but such is the world we live in. Arabella set down her teacup, her expression thoughtful. I do not tell you this to gain your sympathy, Marcus. I tell you because you asked how I became resilient, and the answer is simply this. I had no other option. The world offered me no protection, no champion, no shelter from its cruelties. I had to become my own defender or be destroyed. He was silent for a long moment, the firelight playing across his harsh features. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her with a grace that seemed at odds with his powerful frame. You have a champion now, he said quietly, taking her hands in his. Whatever else may pass between us, whatever the courts may decide, know that I will never allow anyone to harm you. You have shown me more kindness in these few months than I have known in 7 years of wandering. That debt is not one I take lightly. Arabella's breath caught in her throat. His hands were warm around hers, his face so close she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. Her heart pounded with sudden awareness of how much had changed between them, of how the hostility of their first meeting had transformed into something far more complicated, far more dangerous. Marcus, she whispered, uncertain what she meant to say, only knowing that his name on her lips felt like both confession and prayer. Whatever might have happened next was shattered by the sound of carriage wheels crunching through the snow outside. They sprang apart as though burned, Arabella rising hastily to her feet while Marcus strode to the window to peer out into the winter darkness. Visitors, he announced, his voice carefully neutral. A grand carriage. I do not recognize the crest. The household erupted into sudden activity as Mrs. Garrett rushed to receive the unexpected guests, and footmen hurried to light additional lamps. Arabella smoothed her hair and dress with nervous hands, acutely aware that she was about to be examined and judged by strangers who would no doubt have opinions about her unconventional situation. The drawing-room doors opened to admit Mr. Pembroke looking grave, and behind him a figure that made Marcus stiffen with visible shock. Lady Cordelia Ashby stood framed in the doorway, her golden hair immaculately arranged beneath a fashionable bonnet, her travelling costume of deep burgundy velvet emphasizing her slender waist and elegant carriage. She was, Arabella realized with a sinking heart, stunningly beautiful, the sort of woman who made other women feel dowdy and insignificant by mere comparison. Marcus, Lady Cordelia breathed, crossing the room with outstretched hands. It is true. You are alive. When the news reached London, I could not believe it. I had to see for myself. She threw her arms around him with an intimacy that spoke of long acquaintance, and Arabella felt something twist painfully in her chest. Of course, a man like Marcus would have a history, would have known beautiful women who had mourned his supposed death and rejoiced at his return. She had been foolish to imagine that their winter of growing closeness meant anything beyond forced proximity and mutual convenience. Lady Cordelia, Marcus said, disentangling himself with what seemed like reluctance. I am surprised to see you here. How could I stay away? Lady Cordelia's laugh was musical and perfectly modulated, the laugh of a woman trained from birth to captivate. When I heard what had become of your inheritance, I knew I had to offer my support. She turned then, her gaze falling upon Arabella with a coldness that belied her charming smile. And this must be Miss Sinclair, the woman who has caused such a stir. Arabella curtsied with the dignity that had become her armour. Lady Cordelia, I hope your journey was not too difficult. Oh, I never mind a little discomfort in pursuit of a worthy goal. Lady Cordelia's eyes swept over Arabella's simple dress with barely concealed disdain. And I see you have made yourself quite at home in dear Marcus's ancestral seat. How very resourceful of you. The barb was delivered with such perfect sweetness that a casual observer might have missed its sting. But Arabella had survived years of Lady Millicent's pointed remarks and similar encounters with society's more malicious elements. She refused to rise to the bait. The Duke's bequest placed me in an unexpected position, she replied calmly. I have simply attempted to discharge my responsibilities to the estate and its people. How very noble. Lady Cordelia turned back to Marcus with a proprietary air that made Arabella's stomach clench. Now, Marcus, darling, you must tell me everything. 7 years lost in the wilderness. It sounds absolutely harrowing. You poor brave man. She led him toward the settee, chattering brightly about mutual acquaintances in London and the scandals he had missed during his absence. Marcus went. Though Arabella noticed, he cast a glance back at her that she could not quite interpret. Apology? Frustration? Or simply embarrassment at being caught in an awkward situation? Whatever the meaning, Arabella had received the message clearly enough. Whatever had been building between her and Marcus, whatever tender shoots of connection had begun to unfurl during their winter of truce, Lady Cordelia's arrival had trampled them flat. A man like Marcus belonged with a woman like Lady Cordelia, beautiful, well-born, polished to perfection by society's demanding standards. Arabella was merely an inconvenient obstacle, tolerated for the moment, but destined to be swept aside when the courts finally ruled in Marcus's favour. She slipped from the drawing-room without anyone noticing her departure. Let Lady Cordelia have her reunion. Let Marcus remember the world he had left behind, the expectations that awaited him once this legal tangle was finally resolved. Arabella would do what she had always done. She would endure, survive, and ultimately emerge with her dignity intact, even if her heart was in pieces. The days that followed Lady Cordelia's arrival were an exquisite torture that Arabella bore with practiced stoicism. Lady Cordelia installed herself in the finest guest rooms as though she were already mistress of the house, making subtle suggestions about changes to the decor and the management of servants that cut at Arabella's authority like 1,000 small blades. She monopolised Marcus's attention with tales of London society, dragged him into long walks across the snow-covered grounds, and filled the evenings with spirited discussions from which Arabella was effectively excluded. And yet, sometimes Arabella caught Marcus watching her across the dinner table with an expression she could not quite decipher. Sometimes he sought her out in the library when Lady Cordelia was resting, engaging her in conversations that seemed designed to recapture the intimacy they had developed before the interruption. Sometimes his hand brushed against hers in passing, and she could have sworn she felt him tremble at the contact. She is insufferable, Mrs. Garrett muttered one morning, helping Arabella sort through correspondence that Lady Cordelia had deemed too boring for her attention. All airs and pretension, that one. The old Duke would never have tolerated such behaviour. Lady Cordelia is a guest, Arabella reminded her gently, even as her own frustration threatened to boil over. We must show her every courtesy, the housekeeper snorted. Courtesy does not mean allowing her to treat you as though you are the interloper. This is your house, Miss Arabella, whatever the courts may eventually decide. The old Duke chose you for a reason. Do not let that painted peacock make you forget it. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on the wings of a winter storm that had trapped everyone indoors for 3 days. Nerves were frayed, tempers short, and even Marcus's habitual reserve had worn thin under Lady Cordelia's relentless campaign of charm. They were gathered in the drawing room after dinner, listening to the wind howl around the ancient stones of the manor, when Lady Cordelia chose to launch her assault. "Marcus, darling," she said, her voice pitched to carry throughout the room. "I have been thinking about what is to happen once this dreary legal business is finally resolved. I have spoken with my father, and he agrees that a celebration would be in order. A ball, perhaps, to announce our understanding to society." Arabella felt the blood drain from her face. She kept her eyes fixed on the embroidery in her lap, her needle moving with mechanical precision through the fabric, while her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Our understanding." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, but Arabella detected an undercurrent of something that might have been anger. "Well, of course." Lady Cordelia laughed as though stating the obvious to a slow child. "We have always been intended for each other, have we not? Even before your unfortunate disappearance, our families had discussed the match. Now that you have returned, there is no reason to delay. Once you have reclaimed your inheritance and disposed of this awkward pretender, we can proceed with the wedding." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the howling wind and the crack of ice against the windows. Arabella did not look up from her embroidery, could not look up, for fear of what her expression might reveal. "Lady Cordelia." Marcus's voice was flat, dangerous in its lack of inflection. "You presume a great deal." "Presume?" Lady Cordelia's laugh held a note of uncertainty now. "I presume nothing that was not already understood between our families. Then allow me to clarify." Marcus rose from his chair, his tall figure casting long shadows across the firelit room. "There is no understanding between us. There never was, whatever our families may have wished. I am 7 years changed from the man you knew, and I find that the values I once held have shifted considerably." Lady Cordelia's perfect composure cracked, revealing something ugly beneath the beautiful surface. "You cannot possibly mean that you prefer her." She flung a contemptuous gesture toward Arabella. "A nobody. A fortune hunter who has bewitched you with her pretense of humility." "Miss Sinclair," Marcus said, his voice suddenly warm in a way that made Arabella's heart leap despite her determination to feel nothing, "is the finest woman I have ever known. She came to this estate expecting nothing, demanding nothing, and has devoted herself to its welfare with a sincerity that puts the rest of us to shame. If she is a fortune hunter, then fortune has chosen its hunter well, for I cannot imagine a worthier custodian of the Ravenscroft legacy." Lady Cordelia's face contorted with fury. "You are mad. 7 years in the wilderness has robbed you of your senses. When you come to your right mind, you will regret this insult." "The only thing I regret," Marcus replied coldly, "is not seeing your true nature sooner. I shall have your carriage prepared for first light, weather permitting. Your presence in this house is no longer welcome." Lady Cordelia stormed from the room in a whirl of burgundy silk and barely suppressed rage. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the portraits on the walls. And then there were two. Arabella finally looked up from her embroidery, her hands trembling too badly to continue the pretense of work. Marcus stood by the fireplace, his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "She is well born, beautiful, exactly the sort of wife a duke should have. I am nothing, nobody. You are everything." Marcus crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees before her chair as he had done that evening before Lady Cordelia's arrival. "You have been everything to me since I first saw you sitting in that drawing room, facing down my fury with nothing but your dignity. I have fought against this feeling, told myself it was madness, reminded myself of all the practical reasons why I should hate you. But I cannot hate you, Arabella. God help me. I believe I love you." The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any storm raging outside. Arabella felt tears streaming down her cheeks, tears she had refused to shed through all the months of uncertainty and rejection and quiet heartbreak. "You do not mean that," she managed. "You cannot mean that. We have known each other only a few months. We began as enemies. And now?" He took her hands in his, pressing them against his chest, where she could feel the rapid thunder of his heart. "What are we now, Arabella?" She looked into his grey eyes, those storm-cloud eyes that had once regarded her with such cold hostility, and saw there a vulnerability that matched her own. He was offering her his heart, this proud, wounded man who had survived 7 years of hell to return to a home that had been given to a stranger. He was kneeling before her, begging her to love him in return. "I have loved you," she heard herself say, "since you laughed in that frozen field, since you saw me, truly saw me, for the first time, since you stopped being the Duke's son fighting for his inheritance and became simply Marcus, the man who understood my heart." His kiss, when it came, was everything she had never dared to dream of. It was tender and fierce, desperate and gentle, a promise made without words but understood in the deepest chambers of the soul. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he breathed. "Whatever the courts decide, whether you are the Duchess of Ravenscroft or merely the woman who loved me enough to share my life, marry me, Arabella," she answered with another kiss. The following spring saw the grandest wedding the county had witnessed in living memory. The courts, presented with evidence of Marcus's survival and his genuine affection for the woman his father had chosen as heir, had fashioned a compromise that satisfied everyone except Lady Millicent, who retired to Bath in a perpetual state of outrage. Marcus was confirmed as Duke of Ravenscroft, while Arabella received a substantial settlement that she immediately invested in improvements for the tenant farmers. The legal fiction was that she had agreed to surrender her claim in exchange for a fortune. The reality was that she had gained far more than money could ever purchase. The ceremony was held in the ancient chapel on the estate grounds, where generations of Ravenscrofts had pledged their vows. Arabella wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Garrett and the household staff had laboured over for months, determined that their mistress should outshine any London beauty. Marcus, resplendent in formal attire that somehow failed to tame his wild energy, waited at the altar with an expression of such naked joy that even the most cynical observer could not doubt the sincerity of his feelings. As Arabella walked toward him down the stone aisle, past the assembled guests and the winter sunlight streaming through stained glass windows that had witnessed 5 centuries of marriages, she allowed herself a moment of wonder at the journey that had brought her here. From the modest room of her employer's house to the grandest estate in the north. From poor relation to duchess. From a life of quiet desperation to a love that defied all expectations and exceeded her wildest dreams. "You are breathtaking," Marcus whispered, as she reached his side. "My heart threatens to burst from my chest at the sight of you." "And you," she replied softly, "are everything I never knew I was searching for." The vows they exchanged were ancient and simple, words spoken by countless couples over countless years. Yet for Arabella and Marcus, they carried a weight of meaning that transcended tradition. They were promising each other not just fidelity and support, but understanding, acceptance, the kind of deep connection that few souls were fortunate enough to find. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted into applause that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Marcus kissed his bride with a passion that made several elderly guests fan themselves and brought roses blooming to Arabella's cheeks. Then, hand in hand, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft walked out into the spring sunshine where their tenants and servants had gathered to throw rose petals and wish them well. The wedding breakfast that followed was legendary, a feast that would be discussed in the village for decades to come. Toasts were raised, tears were shed, and even the stuffiest members of the local gentry found themselves charmed by the evident happiness of the newlyweds. Lady Millicent's absence was noted with relief rather than regret. As evening fell, Marcus led Arabella onto the terrace overlooking the gardens where spring flowers bloomed in riotous profusion. The manor house rose behind them, its ancient stones warm with the light of countless candles, its windows glowing like eyes full of contentment. "Are you happy, my Duchess?" Marcus asked, pulling her close in the gathering twilight. Arabella leaned into his embrace, listening to the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Beyond happy," she murmured. "I did not know such contentment was possible. I keep expecting to wake and find this was all a dream." "Then we shall dream together," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "For I find I cannot imagine any life worth living that does not have you at its centre." The years that followed brought joys and challenges in equal measure, as such years always do. There were children, 3 daughters and a son, who grew to embody the best qualities of both their parents. There were improvements to the estate, new schools for the tenant children, and modern farming methods that increased yields and prosperity for everyone. There were visits to London where Arabella's natural grace and intelligence won over even the most sceptical members of society, and there were quiet evenings at home where nothing mattered but the love that had grown between 2 people who had once been enemies. Lady Cordelia eventually married a viscount with more money than sense, and made a point of pretending she had never visited Ravenscroft at all. Lady Millicent died in Bath, bitter to the end, her son having emigrated to America to escape her complaints. Mr. Pembroke lived to a ripe old age, frequently invited to dinner at the manor where he would regale the family with stories of the most unusual inheritance case of his long career. And through it all, through triumph and tragedy, through the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that comprise a life fully lived, Marcus and Arabella remained what they had become on that frozen field so many years ago, allies, partners, and above all, lovers whose connection only deepened with time. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, they sat together on that same terrace where they had stood as newlyweds, watching the sun set over the lands they had tended together for 2 decades. Their children were grown now, making their own ways in the world, but the manor still echoed with life and laughter. "Do you remember," Arabella said softly, "when you burst through those doors and accused me of stealing your inheritance?" Marcus chuckled, the sound rich and warm after years of practice. "I was a fool, blind to the treasure that fate had placed in my path. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you refused to cower. And I," she confessed, "began to love you when you showed me that all your anger came from a broken heart. You were not truly hostile, you were terrified." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And you healed me. Day by day, moment by moment, you taught me that it was safe to trust again, to love again. I owe you everything, Arabella." "You owe me nothing," she replied, turning to meet his eyes with the same steady gaze that had captivated him from the beginning. "We found each other. That is enough. That will always be enough." As darkness fell over Ravenscroft and the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, the Duke and Duchess remained on their terrace, wrapped in each other's arms in the profound contentment of a love that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger for the trial. The manor house rose behind them, its windows glowing with welcoming light, a home built not from stones and mortar, but from the countless moments of connection that made a life. She had come to Ravenscroft, expecting nothing, a poor relation with nothing but her dignity to sustain her. He had returned from the dead determined to reclaim what was his, never imagining that his true inheritance would be the woman he found sitting in his father's chair. Together they had discovered that the greatest fortune cannot be measured in acres or gold, but in the wealth of a heart shared completely with another. And they lived, as the stories say, truly and deeply happily ever after.